We want to welcome everybody to Exponential's 180 webinar. And we call it 180 because that is our theme for 2024, 180, Return to Disciple Making. There were a whole bunch of us that coming out of COVID, as we began to just kind of listen to church leaders, not only across the United States, but really around the world, particularly in the West, that there was just like this admission, almost a confession from church leaders that we have not done a good job in making disciples. And so we're dedicating our theme in 2024 to that topic. And we're really excited to have also a book that goes along with it. The book is our theme book for 2024 is 180, The Return to Disciple Making. And it is authored by Jeff Vanderstelt. And I'm telling you, I got a chance early on to read some advance and as an advanced copy and even got a chance to write the foreword. You definitely want to get this. It's just terrific content. And here's the great thing about Exponential. It's also free. So you can actually get it free if you go to exponential.org /180, not the numbers, but the word spelled out 180. You can actually get the book for free. We want to do everything we can to equip you to be disciple-making leaders. We feel like that is core to who Jesus called us to be, but also core to movement making. And of course, I am excited to have the author with us, Jeff Vanderstelt. Jeff is both a thought leader on this topic, but a seasoned practitioner, having really implemented the very things he writes about in several different contexts. And for that reason alone, you definitely want to get a copy of this. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. So, Jeff, good to be together again.
Good to be with you, man.
Yeah. Got your Christmas shopping done?
All done. Yeah.
Seriously. Okay. I hope my wife's not watching because I think I need one more thing. And I think I got time, maybe still today, to finish that up before I'll be done. So
yeah, this might be the first time I've ever been this early, man. I was done like a week ago. So
wow, I'm impressed. Yeah. Hey, I want to tell everybody listening to, if one of the things, I got a whole bunch of questions that I'm excited about interacting with Jeff on, that I think are going to be really helpful to you as leaders and church planners and practitioners in ministry. But even more important than kind of what I want to ask, or I think Jeff would even say what he has on his mind, is we want to address the places where you're going like, hey, I would love for you to give me some help on this particular area around disciple making. So if you want to use the Q&A button, go ahead and use that Q&A button, and we will be addressing some of these questions as we go over the next hour. So don't hesitate to take advantage of that great opportunity. I thought, Jeff, if we could, I would love for you just to give a little bit of context, because our theme today is around from attending to attaching. And I think it's a real pivotal disciple-making shift that you call for in your book, but it's kind of right in the middle of the book. So maybe to make sense out of the broader context of what we're talking about, why don't you take us through each of the shifts? There's 5 different shifts that you talk about in returning to disciple-making. Why don't you just give us 30 seconds on each of those, and then we'll land on this attending to attaching shift.
Great. Yeah, the first one is from reaching to making, that we're making a shift from just reaching people to actually making disciples. And in that, we recognize that we've got to have a definition of a disciple. We've got to have a clear pathway for making disciples. A lot of people have programs with no pathway. And so we want to actually not just reach people, but see them become disciple-making disciples. The second shift is from informing to equipping. And the shift there is that we're not here just to give people information. We're not here just to speak at people. We're here to help them more holistically be equipped in everyday life so they can live this out in the places where they live, work, learn, and play. And in that particular shift, we talk about both the holistic approach to equipping through the 5-fold expression in Ephesians 4, apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher, but also a means by which we can do deeper equipping, which we talked about in a previous one of our recordings. So people can look more at that if they'd like to. This one that we're going to talk about today is from attending to attaching. And this, I won't go into all of it because we're going to talk about it during the whole session, but the basic idea is we're not getting people just to attend things. Like we don't want them to attend their quiet time with God, or attend their accountability group, or attend their personal, their small group, or attend church services. We really want to get them to attach in loving ways, to true loving attachment to God, to self, and to others, as they grow up into Christ likeness. So that one's what we're going to talk about. The fourth one is from a shift from striving to thriving. And in my own journey, as well as in the journey of a lot of leaders that I've observed, you have as well, Dave, over the last several years, we've seen people really lead in some very unhealthy ways. Either we lead people to walk in the flesh and not in the spirit, or we ourselves are not walking in emotionally healthy ways in the way that we lead the things God's given us. And so that's a really, really key shift that we've got to make. If we're going to see the whole organization that we're leading be healthy, we've got to be healthy. And then the last one is from accumulating to deploying. And that the idea there is we're not trying to gain more people, more resources, more buildings. Those aren't evil, but that's not the goal. The goal is to equip so that we can send, just like healthy parents raise up children who can leave the home and start a new home themselves. And so we want to really ask, are we developing a culture that leads to deploying making disciples, not just accumulating people and resources? So those are the 5 shifts that we need to get after.
Yeah, super helpful. And again, if you didn't catch it when I first was making the introduction, and if you're logged in a little late, what Jeff just described there are the 5 shifts in the book that he authored as our theme book for 2024, 180 Return to Disciple Making. And you can get that book for free if you just go to exponential.org/180, the word spelled out 180. And Jeff, you've also, I mean, we've had a couple of conversations, so those conversations are posted there as a resource for folks. But you've also interviewed a couple other people on these topics too. Who have you talked to so far?
Jay Pathick.
Jay, who's the president of the Vineyard, who, I mean, doing some really good stuff in church planning and disciple making.
Yeah, now you said, I'm like, okay, which ones have I done? And
I
which
think
ones
you
have
talked to Danielle. I think you talked to
Danielle
Danielle.
Strickland? We definitely talked. I talked to Slavic as well.
Oh, did you? I don't know. Do we have that one posted yet?
Well, it isn't posted yet, and I'm hoping it will be. He had got caught in a snowstorm, so it was literally on his phone. So I'm like, I don't know if this is going to work or not. So I think we're still trying to capture that, make sure we got it.
And just so our audience knows, Slavic is a just phenomenal church leader, but church planner from the Ukraine, and has some amazing stories. And so I'm really excited about him being at Exponential. I think you also talked to Yvonne Mawarie, didn't
I
you?
did, yeah, I did, yeah.
Who's
He-
a
he-
church planner from Zimbabwe.
yes,
Who, I mean, he's a guy I've gotten to know over the last couple of years, and I always feel awkward introducing him this way, but it's true. He led a pro-democracy movement that overthrew a dictator
yeah.
as a planner. So never underestimate what you could do as a church
It,
planner.
it was crazy because he's like, yeah, I've got this little teeny church, and now I'm a movement leader in my country. I'm like, how cool.
So you definitely want to take advantage. I think Jason just posted where you can check out some of those webinars there in the chat. So make sure you do. You don't want to miss that, and as well as get the book. Well, I'll tell you, let's dive in, because we are talking about that third shift from attending to attaching. And maybe for some of us, maybe a good place to start is you introduce a concept and some language that might be new for some of us, the idea of attaching or attachment love. How does that concept align with a biblical understanding of love? And what does all of this have to do with disciple making?
Yeah, good question. Well, first of all, let's set up the framework with love, because you said that, and Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy 1:5, the goal of our instruction, or the word is telos, the aim, the reason where the direction it's going is we want to move people toward love from a sincere heart, from a pure heart and sincere faith. He says to Timothy. So that's the goal. Jesus, of course, frames up the greatest commandment: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and prophet hang on these. So you've got that framework. And then we hear Jesus say that this is eternal life, that they would know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you sent. And that word know, I think most of the people are listening realize that's not concepts, that's not knowledge about God, it's not ideas about God. It's an intimate connection to God. It's to truly be acquainted with God in a relational way, which is what Jesus prays for in John 17:3, or not 3, but later in that prayer. I just quoted John 17:3, where he says, Father, I pray that as I am in you and you are in me, may they be in us.
Mm.
And that's that idea of attachment. He also says in John 15, if you abide in me and I in you, you'll bear much fruit, but apart from me, you can do nothing. So the goal is this loving relationship that is found in attachment to the God who is love, right? That's why 1 John 4 can say, how can you say you know God who is love, and yet you fail to love your brother who you see right in front of you? And he goes on to say, like, we know that we abide in God if we abide in love. And so that's the concept, is that the true goal of all of our disciple making is that people become in love with God. They're growing in love for one another, and that flows out of a love that's in themselves because they're abiding in the God who is love. So that's the big idea. And then the word attachment is really the same idea of abide when we think about abide. And a lot of times I think when people think of abiding, they think I read my Bible and I prayed my prayers and I go to small group, and isn't that abiding? It's like, no, you can do all of that and never ever attach. That's the scary thing. In fact, a bigger idea that I only do a little bit of hit the tip of the iceberg on, is this idea that Dallas Willard talks about with Jim Wilder, and it's recorded in the book that Wilder wrote called Renovated, where Wilder at the end of his life was saying, how is it that we could train all these people to walk in all the spiritual disciplines and yet they don't become mature? And he said, we ought to define maturity as Christ likeness, as mostly defined by spontaneous love for the enemy. Like if you have
Mm.
spontaneous love for your enemy, you're probably like Christ. And he said, but the problem is so many people have been doing all these spiritual practices that, Willard was brilliant and such a gift to the
Yeah.
church.
Yeah.
But toward the end of his life, he's like, how come there's so little transformation? And he was looking at his wife and the work she does in therapy and saying, there's more transformation for people who've gone through therapy who do spiritual practices than those who haven't. And they concluded it's because as a child, many have never learned to have healthy attachment with a parent. And if we're going to basically relate to God like we related to our parents, and we never have a new experience of attachment in the church and with other believers, then we're going to keep relating to God probably like we related to our parents, which means if we never really had genuine attachment love there, how are we going to know how to have it with God who we can't see? And I think that's exactly what 1 John 4 is saying. It's like, it's not just saying you should love your brother. I think it's saying if you can't love your brother who you can see, then how is it that you think you can attach to a God you can't see?
Yeah.
And so that's the big idea, is that the goal is love. The formation requires love, which requires attachment to the God who is love. And that's what we want to have as the aim of all of our practices.
And I kind of wanted to start there, maybe some selfish motives, because I mean, some people might, if they are even vaguely familiar with attachment theory, might think, oh, well, Jeff's floating off into some, psychological babble. But that's not the case. I mean, what you're describing there is very consistent with a biblical theology, and the Jesus Creed. This is what it means to love God and love others. And
Yeah.
I think that word too, attachment, makes me think of it differently than candidly. It helps me think more fully, maybe I should say, about abide or remain than I have in the past. All right, so but in the book too, and let's back up a little bit, you are calling us out of kind of maybe the way we used to think about discipleship or disciple making, of attending, which maybe I'm guessing we're talking about programs, that kind of stuff. I'd love your comments on that, towards creating relational spaces. Uh, Critique again where we've been, but also then give us a little bit why it's so important we need to move towards these relational spaces that can allow us attached to God and others.
Yeah, the critique would be that I think we've seen ourselves as successful if people show up. And the more people that show up, the more successful we believe we are. And yet we all know, when we look at the life of Jesus, the crowds didn't know Jesus. Like, they weren't his disciples. Just because they showed up to hear him speak didn't mean that they were just becoming a disciple of Jesus. He had a very small group. And that group, like, spent real life together. They really understood what Jesus was talking about when he was talking about the relational nature of disciple making. And so I think the warning is that if we're not careful, we think we're doing the work of making disciples because people just attend the events that we put on. And I would take that even further. And that's why I said at the beginning, even attending my time with the Lord in the morning, it's very possible to read my Bible and never attach.
Mm.
Jesus says that to religious leaders. You diligently search the scriptures, thinking that by them you'll have eternal life, and yet you failed to come to me. And later on, he says all the scriptures were always pointing to him. And so they're not relationally connected to Jesus, but they're Bible scholars,
Yeah.
which is crazy. I mean, they know their Bible better than anybody, and yet they don't know God. Later, Jesus says, He's not your father. Like, you think Abraham is your father, you think God is the one you're meeting, but you're really more of a child of the devil. Really
Mm.
hard words, right? These are to the religious leaders who know their Bible really well, who pray at least 3 or times a day or more. I mean, they're very engaged in the practices. They're attending the events, but they don't know God. And that's the thing. I'm scared of. I have some healthy fear around that for the American church, because if it's true, Jesus says, if you love me, and by the way, that's not an emotion, that's I'm giving my life to him, he's giving his life to me, we are attached. If you love me, you will obey my commandments. And when I look at a church that has a hard time obeying the commandments, I wonder, do they know God? Do they love him? Because
Right.
it's the outcome. It's not, we don't do it so he'll love us, and we don't do it to prove our love. I think it's saying, if you have a loving attachment with the God who came in the form of Jesus, if you're attached to him, you will do what he's doing. Just like Jesus can say, I do nothing apart from the Father. Whatever the Father's doing, the Son is also doing. I think he's saying the same with us. If we're attached to him, the very things that Jesus is doing are the things that we will be doing.
I want to kind of dig a little deeper on that. I mean, I think probably everybody here, and we may all, many of us will probably experience it in the next week or so, where you show up with a group of people, but you don't necessarily feel attached.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, and you're calling, no, it's not just good enough to show up on a Sunday. There needs to be a real attachment with one another.
Yeah.
And love it. Now, that was interesting to me to hear you talk about. Yeah, it's possible to read your Bible, okay, and even have your devotions or whatever, but not feel it. Can you just I think I can go there with you. Was there ever a time or a season where where you realized, "Hey, I'm doing the stuff, but I'm not feeling attached?" Like back to the Bible reading devotion kind of thing for you personally?
Oh, it still happens. I mean, even now, like, there are
How do you know the difference? Like when it
yeah.
isn't happening?
Well, I think the one is that when I read the Bible as a goal to read the Bible, then I tend to not be present with myself or with God in that moment. But when I say, God, I want to meet with you, I want to I want to hear from you, I want to invite you to speak to me. And even my own journey the last few years, I don't know that I was very present with me. So I don't know that I could be very present with God because I didn't know where I was.
That's interesting, yeah.
So I've had to learn how to go, okay, where am I today? I'm lonely. I'm sad, I'm lonely. I've got some fear right now. God, I'm going to show up with you. And I'm learning to actually let my time with the Lord begin with something more like a psalm. I don't mean like reading the psalm, although sometimes that's it, but like my own psalm. Like the
Mm.
psalmist can say, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's feeling super lonely. And Jesus says the same thing from the cross. So I'm learning to go, okay, God, here's where I am. I feel lonely right now for you. I'm really sad and I need some comfort. I'm hurting and I think I need some healing. And I'm going to show up with where I'm really at with you when I read my Bible. And I want you to show up with where you're really at with me, attending to what's going on inside of me. And I think when I take the time to do that, I'm present with him. He's present with me. When I don't, he's present with me, but I'm not aware of his presence. Like I might not be present with him. He's still present with me. And that's where I think I miss out on the opportunity for genuine relational attachment with God in those moments.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, that's helpful personally.
Hmm.
I'll tell you what too. I mean, you guys, men and women are listening to. I mean, you had a great opportunity to just ask Jeff questions as we go along. We already got some questions coming in, but use the Q&A button. Use the Q&A button to if there's things you'd like to ask Jeff specifically. There's application or other kind of nuances of each of these topics. I want to go back to kind of creating these spaces for relational
Mhm.
attachment.
Yep.
Uh, how do you do that? And maybe we can jump in with the question we have here. Randy is asking this question: the role of the small group disciple making in church planting. So, kind of like, what's the role? Is that part of the way that you create these spaces?
Yeah, let me walk through the spaces maybe first, just to set up the spaces, because I think there are kind of five discernible spaces. Just sociologists identify these. We see these in the life of Jesus as well. There's
Yeah, I'll
that.
tell you what. There's five of them.
Yeah,
So Jason's helping us in the chat. So Jason, maybe you can type these in here, those five, so people can make sure they note those. Go ahead.
yeah. So you got divine space. Jesus would often withdrew to solitary places to be with the Father, be alone with the Father. That's our time alone with God the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. There's transparent space. Some might call that intimate space. It's where I let you see the real me and you show me the real you. And we probably don't have a lot of people in that space. Jesus had Peter, James, and John getting to see him at the transfiguration. So you've got that space where people really know your story, really know what you're going through. And let me back up and tell you what needs to happen in each space. In the divine space, it's where we get attached to love,
Okay.
right? The God who is love. You can't bring love that you don't have.
Fair.
So the way that we become loving is we connect to the God who is love. And then in our transparent space, we do the work with each other where we can show up where we are really wounded, where we're really broken, where love has not yet transformed us, and we're willing to be really, that's the high risk, high vulnerable space where I'm not going to hide anything from you. You're going to know the real me. And that's where I can start to see, is that love transforming the real me? And then you've got the personal space, which I think is small groups, and
Okay.
I think that's where we practice love. All the one another's is where we learn to grow in love, and you can usually discern whether or not you're growing in love by how well you're doing in that space with people that you maybe wouldn't choose to do life with, but somehow you find yourself doing life with them. And I think that's the beauty of the church. It's the best place to test out love because we learn to bear with one another, forgive one another, pray for one another. Like all the one another's are where we practice love for some others that aren't necessarily our closest friends all the time, right? And then there's the fourth space, which is our social space. You see Jesus. Oh, by the way, the personal space with Jesus, you see with the 12 disciples and the five or so other women that are joining him on a daily basis. And then you've got the social space, which I think you see at the feast in Cana or Jesus going to Matthew's house for a meal. It's that space that gets to be around 20 to 70 people. You probably know them by their face. You probably know their name. You probably don't know them that intimately, but you also might serve together or care for each other, or do unique things together. And I think it's in that space that we start learning how to love our enemy. Because a lot of times, it's those people that are in our social space, or I'll call it missional space, where God sent us to be on mission to these people, that we actually have to grow in love for people that we may not even like at all. And I think that's where that gets expressed, or loving the stranger, or loving the outsider. Like all, that you're growing in love when you're starting to love those kinds of people, which is what Jesus or God had most against Israel, is that they didn't love that group of people, the stranger, the exile, the enemy, right? And then the last space is what we'll call public space. And that's like Jesus speaking to the crowds. That's our gathering maybe on Sundays. It's going to a Seahawks game in my case. You're in a place where everyone has something they have in common, but they don't really know each other that well. But it's still important to be together, to remember you're not alone in this world. There's some big things that you're giving your life to together. And I think that's our Sunday gatherings. And in the book, I talk about we need to even think through how we build our liturgy on a Sunday to actually help people grow in all the other practices in all of life, so that they'll actually know how to do attachment love outside of the building or outside of the gathering. So those are the spaces, and I think that answers the question about small group. I think the small group is the place where we discern how well we're growing in love. And then you can just reverse it backwards, right? If this is the small group space and you realize, man, I have a really hard time loving these kinds of people. Then you go into your transparent space, say, let's talk about that. What's going on inside of you? Why is it so hard to love people? Well, I've got a story here, and I've
Mm.
got story of abandonment, and I've been abandoned before, and I feel like I'm going to get abandoned again, or I've been hurt. I think I'm going to get hurt again. And we need a safe space to talk about that. Like I believe Jesus had that with John and Peter and James, that they were super close. And so, and then we can take that into our divine space and go, okay, Father, I'm realizing some things about myself I want to talk to you about. I want to ask you to bring some healing to. So all the spaces are interactive in that sense and really work together if we understand what they're for.
So you got divine space, transparent space, personal space, social space, and
Yeah,
then the public space.
that's
And
right.
um, I guess I mean I hadn't thought about this. I mean, but everybody's interacting in those spaces all the time.
They are. Yep.
So it's not like really. I mean, for the most part, it's not like they're optional. You are doing it, and the question is how you're going to do. Is that am I right about that?
That's it. Yeah. And what I would say as church leaders, our job ought to be less about trying to create a bunch of spaces for everybody to live in and more about helping them live in the spaces they're already at. Now, what's one thing that we do as a church, I think, is we create spaces when they don't exist for somebody. Like if they don't know how to have live life in a certain kind of space, they're probably unhealthy if they're not living in one of those spaces intentionally. So our job might be to say, let's help you have a holistic life where you're growing in love in every space. And by the way, if you don't know how to have these spaces, we'll show you. And the one we do create is a public space, though they're doing public spaces elsewhere, but ours is unique as we gather as the church. But most churches put together small groups too, but that's because people aren't healthy. I
I,
mean, right? If they were healthy, they would form around more people than just their local their nuclear family. If they were healthy. If they were on Jesus' mission, they would realize the place where they work or live or play are the missional spaces, and they would engage those intentionally. Many people don't because they don't realize that they're supposed to be on mission in the social space. So in some ways, it's us helping them intentionalize space they're already living in or become healthy so they have spaces they're missing out on.
that's one of the reasons I love interacting with you because it's like I mean I think it is grounded in really good theology, but then there's also like, hey, here's just the practical stuff, and
Yeah.
that which is kind of more the way I'm wired. I want to shift a little bit, then talk about some of the practices that church leaders, pastors, or planners can engage in to grow in this attachment love with God and others.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in fact, it kind of Miguel asked a question here, and maybe we can address that as a part of this. How would you help a person who's good at disciplines but not good at attaching to make that shift? Maybe there are some practices you come across.
Yeah, I mean, I think one, you've got to find some people who know how to attach and start to spend time with them and probably have them help you learn how to attach. I do think the Psalms are a really beautiful guide for it. Um, because the Psalms are basically you showing up with your honesty about where you're really at, the good, the bad, the ugly. And I think if you can turn those Psalms into your own personal prayers where you start showing up with where you're really at, then I think you'll start to practice being present. And when you can be present, then you can start to attach. And this is why I'm convinced that Jesus started the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes, because that's all that is that's you showing up with where you're really at. Blessed are the poor in spirit. That's just a person who's really in need, for there's the kingdom. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. That's a sad person. They're experiencing loss in life. And if you go through all the Beatitudes, it's interesting. I think he starts there because you can't get to the other stuff unless you get through this first. Like I can't go love my enemy. I can't deal with my lust problem. I can't pay attention to like how I relate to people who've hurt me, all that, unless I start with showing up with myself in need of God. And so I think for me personally, I just start with a feeling check in every morning. I basically have 8 primary emotions. I just say, what am I feeling today?
Do you,
Sad,
you write
lonely.
it? You write it down, or you just
I write it in my journal. Yeah, I actually write the date. I write a check in and then I write the feelings I'm having in the moment because as soon as I have a feeling, it makes me aware of a need. If I feel sad, I know I need comfort from God. If I feel hurt, I know I need his healing. If I feel angry, I know I need to have a voice that I cry out to God about something I'm really angry about. If I feel shame, I know that I need to attune to my need for him to be for me what I'm not for myself. If I feel guilt, I know I have a need for forgiveness. If I feel glad, I know I have a need to celebrate with him and give thanks for all that he's done. If I feel lonely, I know that I need his companionship and I need his friendship in that moment. So those emotions make me aware of my needs, and it's through my needs that I become present for relationship. And you can't have relationship apart from being aware of your need. And that's where attachment starts, is I'm now aware of my need
Mm,
and my need for someone else to come join me in that need, and now I can attach. Without that, I don't have attachment. And sadly, most of our development as disciples has been frontal cortex and left brain, right? Which is ideas, concepts, logic, reason, but that's not relationship. You don't get relationship through that stuff. You might know about the one you relate to, but you won't. It's like if someone gave me a book about my wife, but I never ever interacted with her, we wouldn't have a relationship.
right.
And so I've got to move to right brain development. And there's lots of people writing about that right now. So I've got to get into right brain activity that engages the emotions, engages the relational need and awareness of need. So that's how I get to that place of attachment. If I'm not aware of my feelings and my needs, I can't move towards relational attachment.
And when you started that that explanation too, you started with you need to find someone that can teach you how to attach.
Yeah,
And
if like all of this
it-
doesn't make any sense to you right now, you're like, I don't know what he's talking about.
no, no, yeah, right. But no, to me, it like sparked some things. It was going like, oh, so I mean, really, I mean, attaching is synonymous with disciple making.
That's right. You
Because I
got
need
it.
to find someone who's going to disciple me, or you might say, I need someone who's going to help me learn how to attach to other people and attach to God.
That's right.
And
Exactly.
I think those subtle word shifts are so important because it sparks new ideas and you get out of the old ruts of how you think about certain things, which
Yeah, and by the way,
I love about
a
this.
way you might go, "How do I find that kind of person?" Well, one thing I will tell you is those kinds of people are very present, and when you're with them, you sense that they truly see you. Like, you have an intuition that says, "This person isn't somewhere else. They really are here in this space with me right now."
Yeah,
And when you find people like that, go learn from them,
yeah,
'cause they probably are experiencing significant attachment.
yeah. And then try to become one and help someone else.
That's right, and that's the whole disciple making process.
Love it. All right. So keeping with this idea, this shift, we're trying to move from attending to attaching. Again, if you got questions you want to interact with Jeff here, I mean, don't hesitate to put those in the Q&A there, and we would love to talk about some of those. But as we're making this shift from attending, okay, just that is like showing up at a place as a to really attaching to God and others. One of the things you emphasize knowing God through Scripture.
Mhm.
I would love some kind of practical steps that people can take with Scripture to effectively attach to God. Because you gave us a little bit of warning early on about, hey, you could be reading the Bible and still not attached. So, how do you actually read the Bible and make sure you're attaching?
Yeah, I mean, some of it I already said, which is practice showing up before you read, being present
Right.
with yourself so you can bring your real self to the scriptures. I think another one is a practice that many know of, which is Lectio Divina. It's inviting God to speak through the word
Hmm.
and have voice in your heart as you read. And so we'll often train people just read a small portion of scripture, ask the Holy Spirit to draw out ideas, concepts, maybe a phrase or a sentence that stands out. And if you do this, be weird, but I've experienced many times. It'll almost look like the words come off the text, like when you're looking at them. It's really powerful what the Spirit can do. It's God's word is living and active. God still speaks through it. So I'll often encourage people read it once, ask the Spirit to bring to mind whatever phrase, words, ideas you can't escape. They just there, they pop out. Then read it a second time and say, why? Why those words? Why those phrases? God, what are you saying to me about that? Why did you make that me aware of it? And then third, read it again and say, now, what do you want me to do as I engage in my relationship with you and other people in light of what you just said? that's a simple practice of engaging with God through the word, not just engaging the word. Because we're now having a conversation with the one who inspired it for us. So that's one practice of it. Another is you can take any scripture and then turn it back into a prayer. And I'll often use some key questions like, who is God? What has he done in this text? Who am I? And in light of that, what do I do? And then I turn that into a prayer. Who is God? That's adoration. I'm going to tell you who you are. You are loving. You are kind. You're so kind to me. What have you done? I'm now going to confess out loud what he's done, or give thanks to what he's done to me. Thank you for loving me through giving me your son. Now it's taking the ACTS prayer and just changing the order a little bit. AT, adore, give thanksgiving, then confess out loud. Like, as I realize this is who it says I am, I don't live this way. I know I'm not living in the light of who you say I'm holy, but I'm not living holy. You say I'm more than a conqueror, but I live like I'm not. I want to confess that out to you, Father, that you would change my belief about myself in light of you. And then supplication. And now, will you help me to do what you told me to do through this text? I can't do this without you. Will you do it in me? Will you do it through me? I need to abide in you as we move forward today to live this out. That's an easy way to take the scriptures and make them an interactive conversation with God.
You also, in the book, you do talk about silence and solitude and how they can help, attached to God. Talk about, just give us a little more on that and why that can be so helpful too.
Yeah, the goal of solitude is that we get away from everything, right? So we're going off to a solitary place where we can be alone. And I want to say this is really important: alone with yourself and alone with God, both. Some people go and they say, I'm going to go be with God. It's like, no, you got to be with yourself too. And that's the whole point of silence, is if I can be quiet and not read something or write something for a while, then the stuff that's inside of me starts to come out. Now, I might want to write that down as I'm getting it, but I talk to people who go do silence and solitude, and they're like, yeah, man, I did a review of the last 90 days. I wrote everything that I did well and things I got to work on. And then I wrote out the next 90-day plan. I'm like, there was no silence in that at all. That was called a planning day. Don't call that silence and solitude. The point
I
of
think
silence.
I think you just were taking a look at my silence and solitude bit right there. That was
Yeah,
it. You
it used to
described.
be mine too. But it's like, no, be quiet long enough to pay attention to the murmur of the heart. Like, what's your body saying to you? You've been given a temple. Pay attention to it. It's supposed to speak to you. It's going to give you cues. What are the murmurs coming up? What are the fears, the worries, the sad? Like, pay attention to what's coming up in that place of silence and just let it keep coming. And as you do this, you'll actually be present with yourself. And then you can be present with God with yourself. Like, I'm bringing my true self, God, to you in this space of solitude where nothing else is going to be distracting me. I want to be fully with you in this space, fully with myself. So I bring the true Jeff to God, not some false Jeff. And for a lot of us, we're constantly bringing our performance self, not our real self.
I want to shift from, because you're talking a lot about, we've been talking about quite a bit about the attaching to God. Let's shift now the attaching to one another. Um, in those spaces, how do you create an environment for practicing those one another's? And do you have some specific examples from your own ministry experience where, wow, this is really foster those kind of environments?
Yeah, now we're talking about that personal space, just to be clear, that personal space, and then moves into social space. And so in that personal space, for us, some of the experiences we've had is when you learn to lovingly give yourself to another and also lovingly receive the other giving themselves to you, that's the definition of love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. It's not a feeling or emotion, it's the giving of oneself and the receiving of another self. So keep that in mind as I go through the illustrations. As we begin to create a culture and environment where we share ourselves and we receive from others their selves, then we get what we see in Acts, which is there was no needy person among them. Why? Because everything they had belonged to one another. So if someone's hungry, then we feed them. If they're lacking clothing, we clothe them. If they don't have a relationship, we become a friend to them. And so this gets really practical if you really get to know each other and people have real needs. Like I remember we had one guy show up. It's like, man, I'm in trouble. I'm in credit card debt. I can't pay for bills. And a typical person would have said, well, you got yourself in that situation. You better get yourself out of it. But that's not what a gospel community does. A gospel community says, I got myself in a terrible situation and Jesus paid the price to get me out of it. He didn't wait for me to pay my own price. He paid it for me. So then a gospel center community says, how do we take care of that guy? And this really did happen. And we said, hey, what can we do to help? And we agreed as a group, we would pay off his credit card. We would actually take his credit cards and say, until you can learn to budget and plan well, that's probably not a good thing for you to have. So then we actually trained the guy how to budget his money, how to plan better. So we were bearing with one another. We were carrying a burden with one another, but we were going to carry the whole burden because he's got to carry some of his own burden as well. And we were being a grace-filled community to one another. So that's just one example. But man, I could come up with tons of examples. Like we have a woman in our group right now who's going through cancer and chemotherapy. And so we're praying for her healing, and we're caring for her husband while she's away getting treatments, and we're being present. They had a dog. Sadly, he's no longer with them, but we would go watch the dog for them. Like there's all these things that we did. The easiest way I could say this, we were just a healthy family. And what does a healthy family do? They love one another really, really well. And that includes all the things I just said: bearing with one another, forgiving each other, praying for each other, serving each other, feasting together. I mean, you see them throughout the text, right? And again, the goal is love. That's the goal, love.
So we've kind of talked about it, our attachment to God, our attachment to one another. As a leader, though, you're kind of responsible for creating a disciple making culture, or I
Culture.
guess we could
Yeah,
even say a culture of attachment. Is that the right way we
that's
talk?
right. Yeah.
Well, one of the questions came in from Randy too, and he's asking that how, in so many words, I think he's really asking, how do we create a culture where that just kind of spontaneously begins to happen, because that becomes normative in that space, that that people are attaching to one another and attaching to God. Have you seen that happen, and have you
Yeah.
see handles on, like, yeah, here's some ways you can intentionally lead a church towards that?
Yeah, let me, before I answer that, there's a couple one others that I left out that will also help this answer, and that is like, mourn with those who mourn, rejoice with those who rejoice. There's this sense that what you're doing when you rejoice with somebody's rejoicing, even if you personally aren't, is you are attaching, because you can't enter into their emotions with genuine care unless you are really with them, right? You can't mourn with those who mourn, weep with those who weep, unless you actually feel their sadness with them, which is what Jesus, Hebrews 4:15, we do not have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but he himself was tested in every way just like we are, so that he's able to sympathize. He's able to be a high priest who can meet us in our time of need. That's what you're doing, is you're doing priestly work, is that you're being present with somebody's emotional reality, and you're beginning to feel it yourself. This is called sympathy, right? I feel what you're feeling with you while you're feeling it. So I'd say creating a culture for attachment based disciple making requires that you become a people who are attuned to your real emotions, because you don't have empathy or sympathy unless you have real emotions you feel. And you can't have it unless you feel it with other people when they're feeling it, which is what the one another's are all about, is I am really with you in what you're going through. Which I'll just say, I'm pretty concerned right now because I hear a lot of rhetoric and talk in the Christian world saying we shouldn't have empathy. And I'm just like, I don't understand how you could ever say that. Like, without empathy, you're not going to have the kind of compassionate care for people. So ask yourself, and this is why I think the book by McKnight, a church called Tove, and there's other books like that have been written by Chuck DeGrout, When Narcissism Comes to Church. Like, those books are confronting a non-empathetic culture, and they're saying, how do you change that culture so that you really have a church that looks like Jesus's high priestly ministry? So I think you've got to see it come down from I don't want to use the top, but like from the leaders, let's say that. Like, it's got to show up in your preaching. It's got to show up in your culture setting activities. If you have staff in your church, is it happening amongst the staff? Do they feel like it's a safe place to show up with their real needs and their real emotions? Or is it becoming what I'm concerned many churches are, is very narcissistic, very toxic, where it's not a safe place to be a broken person anymore? So if you're sensing you want to grow in this, keep asking, is this church a safe place to be broken? Is this staff a safe place to be broken? Do our leaders, when they show up through teaching, preaching, worship leading, whatever it may be, are they showing themselves to be broken and in need? And if they are, then we're cultivating a culture that can learn how to attach, because attachment, again, is always connected to being aware of your needs. So if it's not a place where it's safe to be in need or safe to be weak, then you won't grow people in attachment-based disciple making.
That's helpful, Jeff. We at community, the church I lead, we had Scott come in and meet with our elders and stuff and go through a church called Tove. But I don't think until really this minute I made the real direct line connection between creating a culture that's not toxic and disciple making, because what you're talking about is when you're creating those cultures that aren't toxic, you have empathy for one another, and that empathy is how attachment happens, and attachment is really almost synonymous, if you're talking about with God and others, for disciple making.
It totally is. Yep. And here's the thing, Dave, because it goes back to your childhood again. If you learn that it was unsafe to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
unsafe to have feelings about things, unsafe to be in need, then you learned how to avoid that. And sadly, we've created a lot of cultures in the church where it's where it's almost applauded to not be in need.
Yeah.
Like we say, that's spiritual maturity, is to have no needs. It's like, no. Jesus was the neediest man that ever lived. He said, I can do nothing apart from what I see the Father doing, which is attachment. So he's like, I can't do any of this on my own. I have to have this relational attachment with the Father, because whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. That's what he wants for us. And that's what he wants for not just us and him, but us and one another. That we would have a like-mindedness. That's what Paul says in Philippians, that we would have this same mind in ourselves, which means we're thinking with each other the same thoughts together. That's
Right.
it. That's attachment.
That's good. Hey, Jeff, I think we're out of time. I'm glad these other people could join so I could learn from you.
Oh.
It's like my excuse to get to have about an hour-long conversation with you. Hey, I'll tell you what, if thank you for being here for our Exponential 180 webinar.